Hey everybody, it's Energy Drop, and for today's video, I'm going to be talking about a Fire Emblem draft that I did recently, my first Fire Emblem draft, what I learned from it, why I would recommend people try it out if they've never done it before. I am by no means an expert on drafting techniques or an expert on really any of the Fire Emblem games besides maybe Radiant Dawn. I've played a lot of them. I know what units I like, units that I think are good. This is by no means a masterclass on what OP draft strategies that you can employ, but just tips that I would recommend to people trying it out for their first time, or maybe their first few times. Ways that you can avoid kind of getting burnt out or, setting yourself up for failure, because the draft is very important. It's probably just as important as how you play and plan during your actual playthrough. So I'll talk about a draft that I did with my brother a few months ago on Path of Radiance, a game that we had both played before, but didn't really know extremely well. And we kind of relearned a few things as we were going too. So it was a lot of fun. I'd recommend it to anyone who hasn't tried it before. I would be down to do more drafts in the future, and if that's something that you're interested in me doing video series of, just let me know. But the first thing I'll show you is the actual draft board. So this is me and my opponent is what I call them here on this slide, but these are the units that we have on each of our teams. If you're not familiar with the draft, it's really simple. Basically, you take turns choosing units in a particular Fire Emblem game. These are the units that you can use. So on the top is what my brother chose, and the bottom is what I chose. And these units are put in order not of what we drafted, but of where they show up in the game. And I wish I had the draft order list still, because I think it's really interesting how different people will prioritize different units. I kind of wanted to plan around some chapters that I thought were really difficult early on. So I managed to snag up Oscar and Titania. He chose units that he thought were really valuable early on, with Reese and Soren as one of his favorites. And we just kind of, picked what I think we thought at the time was a very well-balanced team, and just went through the game. Really nothing super special to talk about, except there were a ton of mistakes that we both made and rules that we didn't think of beforehand, talking about could you use units that you didn't draft to recruit other ones. If you're looking at my list now, I have Har, but I don't have Jill. So we didn't really make great rules at the beginning on if we could or couldn't do this. That's something I'd recommend doing if you're going to do a draft, but here's just an idea of what we're working with. I overall was pretty happy with my team, but there were definitely some big holes that I needed to fill. Mainly the fact that I didn't have any magic units except for Tormod and Bastion. I actually had Ileana, but we did a trade near at the end because he thought that Chapter 8 would be too hard with how many low units. How low of a unit count that he had. So we did some swapping around. But anyway, yeah, Tormod was my only magic user for the first 25 chapters of the game, and I lost him right on the Devdan chapter. Even though I couldn't use Devdan, I just wanted to recruit him. So that gimped me pretty hard, but besides that, it was a ton of fun, and honestly it made for a more challenging and interesting run. But if you're drafting, there are some things that I would recommend and things that I'm going to do in my next draft. One of them being prioritizing early units. In any draft, early game units are key. I don't care what Fire Emblem game that it is. I don't care what difficulty setting you're playing on. The units that you get in the beginning of the game, the first 1 to 5 chapters, are so crucial, because you are going to be low manning maps for probably a long time. At the point where you can choose who to deploy, you'll be taking out the units that you don't draft, so you're going to be going into a chapter that has 8 deploy slots with only 4 units. Kind of like point buy, but you won't be filling out with the best of the best or like units that you really think are good on that map. It's just whoever you drafted, and that's who you're stuck with. I would say that in most Fire Emblem games, early maps can be the hardest, especially on like increased difficulties like hard or maniac. We played hard on the hard mode difficulty for this Path of Radiance run. We weren't crazy enough to play on maniac, but it was still pretty challenging, especially like the first, I would say like 10 chapters or so. Even though I had Oscar and Titania, it still wasn't a cakewalk. It wasn't until I got to like that chapter like 12 to 15 range that I really started to ramp up and just kind of steamroll the game. Kind of how Fire Emblem games go. My point being though is that those early maps are going to be hard, especially if you're gimping yourself by like trading away all of Void's axes right at the beginning, right? I don't know how loud my music is. I'll turn that down just a little bit. But yeah, early game units are key, very important. And you have to also think about where the difficulty spike is in any given game. So these are chapters that, for the most part, are like considered the most difficult in the game that you're playing. And Path of Radiance, for example, my personal opinion is that Chapter 8 and Chapter 11 are probably the two hardest chapters in the game, or at least the first half of the game. So my draft strategy was, in Chapter 8, how am I going to have a squad that I'm happy, going through this map with? So Titania and Oscar were like easy first two picks for me. Chapter 11, I didn't remember being as hard as it was, but it was actually really difficult, especially when you're given, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 12 plus Ike deployment slots, and you're only using like 9 total or something like that. Makes a chapter a little bit more difficult. So depending on where your difficulty settings are set, what your draft composition is, and what you think that the hardest maps are, you got to consider the difficulty spike when you're making your draft. Not pictured is chapter 17. That's the 4-part chapter in the Serene's Forest. That's just absolutely miserable to play through. It wasn't very hard. I think that my draft like really took off around that part, maybe just a little bit before, like Marcia promoted. Oscar was like an absolute bulldozer. So I didn't really have trouble with it, but it's just like such a slog to get through. And if you have a bad draft or you lose some key units, I could see it being pretty tough. So consider the difficulty spike when you're drafting your team. And also make your army well-rounded. So this is kind of just like a list of units in Path of Radiance and what weapons they primarily use. A lot of these units will gain weapon utility on promotion, like Jill or Astrid or Marcia, but a lot of their weapon levels are so low that you probably won't train most of them up. So there's only a few characters in the game that really have decent weapon levels in multiple different weapon types. So if you end up drafting, say, a lot of magic units, but you don't have anyone that can really use like axes or bows or something like that, you're probably shorting yourself a little bit for what weapons are available in the game. Your S rank weapons, or if there's certain chapters where, like in Path of Radiance, you get steel axes, but still like iron lances and swords, you're kind of cutting yourself off from some of the power spikes that you would have if you drafted your army a little bit more well-rounded. And that goes for your weapon availability, the type of unit that you're getting, whether they're a high investment unit or they're like a Jagan type that has, really good stats when you get them, but bad growths. If you have a draft that's like high on physical damage or magic damage, like mine, I didn't have any mages since Tormod died until like chapter 25 or whatever you get Bastion at. And then frontline versus ship. This is just the ideology that if you have like a 2-range unit like Rolf, just to soften up the enemy for someone like Mia to be able to one-round them or get through them without taking too much damage on the crackback. These are things that you can think of when you're doing a draft to kind of make sure that your losses don't set you back as far as if you didn't plan for them. So this is something I'll look at more when I do a draft in the future, especially staves. I didn't have a single unit that could use staves at all through the whole game, except for Alencia. I think I had Alencia, I don't remember. But Tormod died, and Bastion uses knives. He's a knife sage. They don't have staves by default in this game. So I didn't draft Mist, I didn't draft Reese, didn't have Khalil, Ileana, or Soren. So like Tormod was my guy, and he died like the chapter after I got him, which was my fault, but that was something that I could have planned for a little bit better, taking either Mist or Reese early on, because not having staves, honestly pretty brutal in Path of Radiance. And that's all the stuff that I have for actually going through doing your draft yourself. But when you're setting up your draft with another person or with multiple people, highly, highly, highly recommend making the rules fun. This seems like a no-brainer, but it's something you really have to think of before you do a draft and put down like in writing or agree upon it or whatever, because drafting is a big commitment. You're going to be sitting down for like upwards of 10 to 20 hours or something like that, probably closer to the 20-hour mark, to beat any Fire Emblem game. You want it to be fun. You want it to be enjoyable. And drafting is fun, but it can be kind of miserable if your draft is bad, or you don't get the units that you want, or you have some unlucky, things go your way and lose some key units. So lean towards making the game less grueling by maybe choosing units that both teams get, or multiple teams if you're drafting with multiple people. So looking at Serene's Forest, their recommendation, I didn't find this until after we did our draft, classic, but like 15 years ago, draft rules were recommended for Fire Emblem games, and for Path of Radiance, Titania was an auto-include. And I see why. Because imagining my draft without Titania and picking up someone like Joffrey or whatever, because I think it's a good idea, I would have struggled so hard in the early game. Also, picking units like Grifka, Tibarn, and Naysala is kind of lame, since like you'd only use one of them, so it just makes sense to have them as auto-includes. You could also say, Racin or somebody, is a good idea for everybody to have, or something like that. Just give it some thought early on. Agree with your partner or the multiple people that you're doing a draft with. Hey, here's some ideas that I have that I think could make this draft more enjoyable. Also, what's allowed for non-drafted units. So if you don't draft, say Jill, for example, right here, are you allowed to recruit Har? I did, because our rules weren't that great set up beforehand. But you would want to agree with the rest of the people that you're doing a draft with, probably before you select your units, what's allowed for non-drafted units. So can they recruit other characters? Can they do meat shielding, which means they just sit up there with no weapon and kind of block choke points and stuff? In Path of Radiance, you can shove, there's chests and doors, stuff like that. It's just dependent on what you guys think is fair and what you think would make the most enjoyable experience. It'll change how useful that some units are. Like Jill is really good, but she's even better if you have to have her to recruit Har, who's also pretty decent in Path of Radiance. So you can think of units kind of like going in pairs if you don't allow non-drafted units to recruit. But if you do, then that kind of makes Jill seem less useful, because she's not tied to Har's recruitment. Or like Leith and Mordecai aren't tied to Stefan's recruitment. Stuff like that. So it's just dependent on what you think and the people that you're playing with think will cultivate a more enjoyable draft experience. And that's it. I'm not an expert in draft, didn't create it, didn't really absorb a lot of content from other people. I just heard about it recently and thought it would be pretty fun to try out, so I did. And I learned a lot of stuff. I think that it's a really awesome way to play Fire Emblem. You know, it's no point buy, but it's still a lot of fun. It's really easy to do, right? You don't have to sit down and go over an exhaustive rules list to do a draft with somebody. Say like, hey, you and I have both played Sacred Stones. What do you think about just like doing Erica's route and doing a draft? You know, and that's something that people could sit down and be like, yep, that sounds like a lot of fun. Let's chalk it up, you know. So I recommend anyone, if you're thinking about doing a draft, go ahead and do it. It's really fun. I would be open to doing more drafts and streaming them in the future if that is what people would want to see. But if you watch it at this point, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.